Welcome, everybody. Dr. Adam here today. Today, we're going to be discussing the biology of the superorganism. All right, so when we talk about honeybees, we talk about them in the context of two different levels. The level of the individual, which we spent time going through the biology of an individual, which is really important to understand the life cycles, the timing of bees, and understanding how they work as an individual. But when we really are managing honeybees, we are managing at a superorganism level. And what a superorganism is this is a quality that we give to social insects, social animals that are working together as a community for really the single proliferation of the organism at large. So when we think about this, think about it like this. So we have a social colony of honeybees. They work together. There's a division of labor. There is communication amongst these individuals. There's organization to the hive and the structure of the hive itself, the hierarchy of these jobs. And all of this comes together as a community to function as a single organism. And really, that's what a superorganism is it's this group of individuals that are functioning as a single organism. And so when we think about the colony, the honeybee, we need to be thinking about them at the superorganism level when it comes to management of them. Now, oftentimes we will consider the case of one individual more than any, which is the queen. And there are certain times where we have to take her as a specific individual into consideration. Say we lost the queen or she gets hurt or something like that. Then we deal with her as an individual. But for the most part, we're always dealing with the colony at the superorganism level. And this picture is to illustrate to you that the superorganism is really a much larger thing than the individual itself. A bee colony, a healthy bee colony, usually has somewhere around 40 to 60,000 honeybees in it. That's equivalent to about a 20 to 30 pound animal. And so that is what we have pictured here on the right is my dog Doobie. He's about a 25-pound terrier mix dressed up as a honeybee in this picture for your enjoyment. But what I want you to think about is when you think about your colony, don't think about the picture on the left, a box of a bunch of bees. Think about the picture on the right, this 25-pound animal that I'm responsible for taking care of. Now, that is a really important thing to understand because oftentimes there's a shift in our mindset when it comes to thinking of things as a superorganism rather than this individual. You know, an individual honeybee is only this big, and oftentimes we really don't consider much of the value of that individual. But when we look at it in totality, we're dealing with a large animal. And so managing it like livestock is really important because we're managing a large animal. The other piece of this that I want you to kind of consider is when you lose a colony, when a colony dies on you, you really should be, in my opinion, that is a point of grief for me personally, because I do think about my bees as 25-pound animals. And if I lost my dog Doobie, there would be a grieving period associated with that. The closer we get to our bees, the more serious we take the management of them. And one of the big, huge things that's out there that a lot of people just don't understand is that honeybees are domesticated animals. We're not managing wild animals when we're managing honeybees. Honeybees have been domesticated for over 4,000 years, and humans are responsible for the proliferation of this species across the world. We've brought it everywhere with us when we've moved around the world. Honeybees are not native to North America. European settlers brought them over. Well, the German black bee was the first one that they brought over. This one was brought over in the 1850s. The European honeybee kind of coincided with the development of the Langstroth hive. But essentially, this isn't a native organism to North America. This is an introduced species. And so we have to understand that because it's our responsibility to take care of them as farmers, as livestock farmers. And you may not think about yourself that way as a beekeeper, but beekeeping is a part of agriculture. You are a farmer by keeping honeybees, and your responsibilities to that livestock is no different than any other livestock. And let's take a look at that. So when we're managing them as a superorganism, instead of thinking about a box of a bunch of bees and thinking about this large animal that we're working with, just like any other livestock, It's our responsibility to provide food, water, shelter, and maintain them as healthy animals. Now, when it comes to food, you may be thinking to yourself, well, Adam, they go and find their own food. Well, they do during the 4 to 5 months there's food out in the landscape in the Upper Peninsula in northern Michigan. What do they do the other 8 months? What do they do? Well, they feed on honey stores, but oftentimes, especially in northern climates, oftentimes they can run short of honey stores in the early part of the spring. This generally is March and April, and my phone blows up during that time of the year because people are upset because their bees survived over the winter, they say. They survived into February, but then they died in March and April. And 9 times out of 10, they died in March and April because of starvation, which is totally on us as a farmer. If your cow died of starvation, that's on you. That's not on the cow. And it's the same thing with honeybees. So it is our responsibility to provide these things for these bees because, again, they are not native to this continent. They are not native. And so we have to understand that. Water. Bees need water. If you don't have a water source within 3 miles of you, you need to provide a water source. And it needs to be a clean water source. Shelter. You already are providing that by putting them in a beehive. And then the health aspect of it. Now, this is where things can kind of get a little contentious with people who kind of take the more natural way of beekeeping. Now, I really struggle with sometimes with individuals who feel that bees can just take care of themselves. And the big piece of this is well, bees have been managed by humans, like I said, for over 4,000 years as domesticated animals. So would you take your flock of chickens and just let them loose out in the woods and expect them to proliferate? No, that's ridiculous. Would you take a cow or a herd and let them loose in the woods and just let them fend for themselves? No, because when winter hits, there's no food to eat. They're going to just starve in the snow. It's the same thing with honeybees. It's our responsibility. So when we manage honeybees, we are managing them at the colony level as a superorganism, as livestock. It's something important to understand. The notion that we can take a hands-off approach to beekeeping is a false notion. If you expect to take a hands-off approach to beekeeping, I will tell you that your bees will die nearly every year. Sometimes you'll get lucky and a couple will survive the first year, but 9 times out of 10, they're all going to die. And the reason is because they need to be managed. They need us, and we need them. There's reciprocity in this relationship. I don't want you to feel like you're putting everything into this and the bees are not reciprocating. They are absolutely reciprocating, but it's a mutually beneficial relationship. But we have to be an active participant in it. We can't take a hands-off approach. All right, so within each hive body, stack of boxes, we have one colony. Okay, so that's our superorganism, is that whole thing in those boxes. Now, each colony, each superorganism contains a queen, it contains workers, it contains drones, it has brood, and it has food. Those are the 5 elements of a healthy bee colony. All right, now queens, you're gonna have one queen in the colony. Now, rarely, and it's like 10% of the time and less, you may have 2 queens. Tends to be a mother-daughter pair. It's a rare instance. Most 90% of the time, 90+% of the time, you have 1 queen per colony. Workers make up the largest proportion of the colony. They're the ones that are the most numerous, and they're also the ones that do all the work. They are the ones where this division of labor is happening. They are doing everything except laying eggs in a healthy colony. Then we have drones. Drones do one thing, and one thing only, and that is mate with the queen. And so they're only around seasonally because that's a seasonal activity. Tends to be that in the spring, we start to see drones put on. The reason for that is in the spring is when we have reproductive swarms. That is the reproduction of the colony at the colony level. So in the spring, a colony will split itself into 2. This is a natural process. Now we can participate in that, and we do that by doing splits. and that prevents the swarm process a lot of the time. But this is a natural reproductive process. And so in the spring, as part of this natural reproductive process, drones are put on, and drones mate with virgin queens. They die after they mate, and they do nothing for the colony other than that. They don't collect food. They just eat food. So they're a suck on resources that way. And the reason, and for that reason, in the fall, drones get kicked out. Drones do not overwinter with the cluster, and workers will actively kick them out of the colony in the fall because there's no use for them. Brood. In this colony, you will also have brood, and that brood is made up of eggs, larvae, and pupae. Then you're also going to have food, and that is in the form of honey, which comes from nectar, and bee bread, which comes from pollen collection. So these 5 aspects of a healthy colony are things that you need to know, you need to be able to recognize, and you need to be able to evaluate to determine if your colony is doing good. And we're going to go in that in detail in a later lecture. But I just want you to understand this is what comprises our superorganism here. Now, as far as the organization of the colony is concerned, this superorganism, when we look at it in the terms of hive bodies and an actual hive stacked up, the brood chamber makes up the lower portion of the colony. This is typically 2 to 3 boxes. So if you're using deeps as your brood chamber, typically 2 deeps. If you're using mediums, it's typically 3 mediums. But what you can think about this is the brood chamber tends to be about 2 basketballs stacked on top of it, like a basketball stacked on top of each other. It tends to be the space that we use for our brood chamber. Now, as far as what is stored there, well, that's where all your brood's at. That's where your eggs, larvae, pupae are. It's also where pollen is stored. And the reason that pollen is stored there is because pollen is the protein source that is fed to young bees. It is also used it is also one of the things used to actually create royal jelly. And so royal jelly is also part of that process of having that pollen nearby. Honey is stored around the brood and also above the brood. Now, when you think about the stuff above the brood, that yellow box that's labeled honey, that's essentially our crop. That's the excess honey that bees are storing above the brood chamber. Now, it's important to note that they store it above the brood chamber because that's the natural orientation of a colony, right? A tree is where a beehive would naturally nest, and trees are vertically oriented. They are not generally horizontally oriented. So that's why this is set up like that. That's why they store it above. They also store above because bees over the course of winter will cluster together to thermoregulate, and they move up over the course of winter, feeding on honey stores, and they use that honey as calories to burn. They use the honey as carbohydrates to burn calories to create heat to maintain the warmth of that cluster. And so the orientation of honey above is an important thing to understand. It is also why long hives, horizontally oriented hives, tend to not do very good in far northern climates. You can keep long hives just fine in temperate climates. When I was in California, we had like 3 weeks where we didn't work bees over the holidays. All the rest of the time we're working bees. There's generally food out in the landscape. It's pretty much a year-round activity. And so a long hive works just fine out there. The problem with getting bees to survive in long hives in harsh climates like we have is that we have months where bees are in this colony, and they need a lot of food resources to maintain temperature over those long periods. And so if the food's not oriented in an upward fashion, say it's oriented in a horizontal fashion, the colony just doesn't move like that. It doesn't move very far horizontally. And so most of the time, your bees will not use all the honey, and they'll starve out before they use all of it in a long hive situation. In a Langstroth hive or any kind of vertical hive, that is not the case because that's the natural orientation of a colony. The honey that's stored around the brood chamber is something that we do not harvest. We only harvest from those upper boxes where the excess honey is stored. When we look into the brood nest, this is what we find. So like I had said just previously, that honey and pollen and brood are stored in the brood chamber. This is generally orientation that we see it in. So if we look at this picture on the right, you can see that this is a kind of a classic brood frame. You have brood in the middle, and this is capped brood that you see here. The way that you can tell that it's brood and not honey is that brood is individually capped. Each cell is individually capped. And you can see that on this picture where there is a clear perforation around the outside of each cell. So that's how you can distinguish brood from capped honey. But brood's always going to be located in the middle of the brood chamber. And in these frames that you see here, you have brood located in the middle of the frame also. And then directly next to it, you see pollen. This is where pollen is stored so that it's in close access to feed brood. Now, brood is really, really reliant on a lot of protein. It takes a lot to grow that little tiny larva that hatches right in that first day to what we know as a bee. So that's a huge process of development and requires a lot of protein in order to build that bee from that very tiny larva. So they rely on protein in the form of pollen for that. And then directly next to that, you see honey storage. And you can see honey is very different when you look at the cappings compared to our brood. Honey is laid down in sheets, whereas brood, like I said, is capped individually. So you won't be able to distinguish the individual cells of honey, whereas you can distinguish the individual cells of brood. Very easy way to tell the difference between the two. So that's what you're going to find in that brood area. As far as above that in the honey super, this is where you're going to see stored honey. So this is after the colony gets established and gets that brood chamber nicely going and filled out, they'll start to store excess honey above the brood chamber. And this is what you're going to see is just like this picture you see here, this is a honey frame. And it's pure honey for the most part. Sometimes you get a little bit of pollen thrown in there as well, but for the most part, it's going to be pure honey. And this is where we harvest honey from. We don't harvest honey from the brood chamber. We harvest honey in full frames from this excess storage facility, that upper chamber, essentially. So that's where the excess honey is stored. Now, the thing that you need to keep in mind is we don't take all the honey from a colony, especially in northern climates. Like I said from previously, I'm originally from California. It's where I started beekeeping. And in California, we can take honey pretty much all the time because there's always resources available. Bees are always flying. We can always feed them liquid syrup. It's not a big deal. You can harvest quite a bit of honey off of a colony. But here, we have to be very cautious about how much we harvest because each of your colonies in the UP is going to need somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds of honey to make it through our long winters. To put that in terms that maybe is a little easier to understand, each one of those medium boxes that we see in this picture, these medium boxes right here in this honey area, each one of those medium boxes will hold about 50 pounds of honey. So to visualize what 150 pounds of honey looks like, it is 3 full boxes of honey. That's a lot of honey. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with up in these northern climates is how much do I leave on? Now, in many circumstances, 100 or 150 pounds may not even be enough. And so that's why we have to check during the winter to make sure they haven't motored through those resources. The longer the winter, the colder the winter, the more honey they go through. Honey consumption is directly correlated to temperature. So the colder it gets, the more honey they have to consume to maintain the temperature of that cluster. For example, I had a colony this year that was a huge colony going into the winter and motored through 150 pounds of honey by January. And I had to supplementally feed that colony the rest of the winter to get it through. If I didn't, that colony would have starved. And that's on me as the beekeeper. That's not the bee's fault. That's my fault. So important considerations when it comes to honey. And we'll talk about this more when we get into overwintering. But I just wanted to kind of plant these seeds in your mind as we're going into the season that, we don't take everything. This is the bee's food. We take the excess of this. All right. When it comes to how hives are essentially kept in check, most of that is done by the queen and queen pheromone. This pretty much is what keeps the colony in check in the form of a queen being the only one that's laying in a colony. and the colony working together to support that brood that she's laying and the proliferation of the colony in general. So keeping colonies in check is what she does, and the way that she does that is through queen pheromone, which essentially suppresses the ovaries of the other workers. Now, workers can lay eggs; they absolutely can, but they can only lay drones because they're unmated. And so, with a queen, when she is present, the ovaries of those other workers are essentially kept in check by the pheromone. They don't develop. But as soon as we lose a queen, and that pheromone is gone, those ovaries develop and workers can start laying at that point. We call that a laying worker situation. You see that at the bottom here on our list. That's when we have no queen, is when we start to get in a laying worker situation. You will see eggs without a queen, but there is a distinct difference. And I'm going to show you that here in just a bit of what you see when it comes to eggs in a queen right colony and a laying worker colony. And it's important for you to be able to make those distinctions, because if you see yourself in a situation where you have single eggs in each cell, that means you're queen right. If you see a situation where you have multiple eggs in each cell, that means you have a laying worker situation and your queen is gone. So important things to know, but that queen is ruling that hive through these pheromones that she's producing. Reproduction is also part of this. Reproduction, the swarming impulse of bees. So as we get into the spring, bees build up very quickly. Congestion starts to happen in the colony. The queen pheromone starts to dilute, and we get into a situation where the colony wants to swarm. As soon as we start to see queen pheromone starting to get diluted in there with a couple other factors, which we'll go over in a different lecture. But as we start to see that happen, that is the natural impulse for swarming. Now, swarming reproductively happens naturally in the beginning of the year as this is all going on, but you can also have swarms any other time of the season, basically due to congestion and that dilution of queen pheromone. So that pheromone also helps with keeping the swarming impulse in check. As the queen pheromone starts to dip, colonies are more likely to swarm. And so that's another thing that queen is doing by keeping that hive in check, keeping all those bees together, because she is a productive, laying, healthy queen. And that's an important thing to note. The term queen right. Let's dive into these terms that we just talked about here in that last slide. So queen right means when we say that a colony is queen right, what we're saying is that there is a queen present, that queen is laying, and we have brood and eggs present. So essentially you have a laying queen if you are in a queen right situation. Now, our queen right situation can be determined two different ways. One, you can see the queen, like you see in the picture right there. Or two, when we get into the height of the season and you got 60,000 bees in a colony and they're just everywhere, it's sometimes very difficult to find a queen. And as you're doing inspections, you do not want to spend an hour trying to find a queen just to determine if you're queen right. That is not the way, that is not an efficient way to do things. And the longer you keep the hive open, the more at risk you are of losing a queen, damaging a queen, getting the hive riled up. You want to get in and you want to get out. So not only can you determine it by seeing the queen with your eyes, but you can also determine it by seeing eggs. Now, I know we're talking about superorganism, but I want you to think back to the biology of the individual lecture. Eggs, which you see pictured in this bottom right corner here, on that black foundation, you see one egg in each one of these cells. If you see this, and you need to be able to see eggs. This is something you've got to train your eyes to. It is something that is difficult for a lot of people, but you have to get yourself to a point where you can see this. Because like I said, you're not going to find the queen all the time. You have to be able to determine if you're queen right through eggs. And that's how you do it most of the time during the season. Very rarely during the season do I find my queen. I usually only may find her in the beginning of the season when the colonies are small. Most of the time, I'm looking for eggs. I'll look for her on frames, but I'm not like trying to find her specifically. If I can see that I've got eggs, what does that tell us? Thinking back to your individual, biology of the individual, what that tells us is that the queen has been there in the last 3 days, because eggs last for 3 days before they hatch. So if you see eggs, you know that my queen was there in the last 3 days. And that is a way you can determine if you're queen right. You didn't see her, but you know she was there in the last 3 days. And so the likelihood is that she's there. So that is a way to determine if you're queen right. And like I said, seeing eggs is really important. The trick to it is that you got to have the sun to your back and coming over your shoulder down into the cells. Other tricks, use black foundation. That's why this pops so well on this picture, is because it's on black foundation. If it was on yellow foundation, it'd be much harder to see. So a little trick to help you see in that. But you have to be able to see this at the colony level to determine if you're queen right. Swarming. So swarming is colony level reproduction, like I said earlier. It is a natural process in the spring. And it really, the reason for it is it supports the proliferation of the species. As colonies die, you know, and if we think about this in a natural context within their native range of bees, which is Europe, Asia, parts of Africa. As we think about this, you know, what we're saying is that over the course of the season, when bees are lost, a colony dies due to whatever in the natural landscape. The way that this species proliferates is by reproducing at the colony level. So we have reproduction of the individual, but like I said earlier, we're focused on the colony level, that superorganism for our management. So that is how this happens. So that's colony level reproduction in the spring. The other time that we see swarming is during times of year when lots of stuff is coming in or bees are growing very fast. And what ends up happening is you get congestion. So usually what happens in the UP and northern Michigan is that we get in the early part of the season, and the first thing that comes in and just gobs is pollen. All the pines are putting off pollen. Most everything tree that's flowering is putting off pollen. If bees are rapidly collecting pollen because the brood chamber is rapidly increasing in size and they need that protein content to continue feeding all these bees. However, pollen can start coming in too fast and in too high of quantities. And what you end up getting is the bees will start backfilling areas, and we call this pollen bound. What that means is that the hive itself has gotten bound up because there's too much pollen coming in. If we don't take some of that pollen out and provide more space for the queen to lay, that queen pheromone starts to dilute because she does not have places to lay anymore because they're occupied by pollen. So essentially the workers and the queen are competing for space. And as she loses places to lay, queen pheromone starts to dilute, brood pheromone starts to dilute, and now the colony is keyed up to swarm because it thinks it's run out of space and it needs to split this colony to relieve some of that pressure. This is due to us as beekeepers. Congestion is our fault. We haven't been staying up on supering to provide excess space for them to continue to grow. So again, this is something on us as farmers. And so this can happen anytime during the growing season. Fall, you see fall swarms all the time. You see swarms at the end of July. You see swarms during the normal swarm season, which is kind of like late June, early July for us here. But it can happen anytime during the growing season due to congestion. That is poor management on the beekeeper. But it's most common during the spring buildup that we see during I'd say late May, early June, going into late June, and during the honey and pollen flows, which are late June through July. So that's important for you to understand, because at that colony level, we have to manage space to ensure that we are not getting congestion and going to be losing half of our bees to a swarm. Okay, laying workers. So when I mentioned laying workers, I said you need to be able to tell the difference of if you've got a laying worker situation or if you're queen right? And I showed you the picture of the queen right colony that had one egg in each cell, right? Look at this picture. There's just gobs of eggs in every single cell. This is a laying worker colony. The queen has been long gone. The queen is long gone. And what has happened is because the queen is gone, that's the one who keeps us in check, right? because she's gone, the ovaries of workers started to develop. And now workers are laying. Now, one of the huge misconceptions about laying workers that's out there in the beekeeping community, and I've even heard this from some novice beekeepers, is that I can fix this. I've heard people tell me that they'll shake their bees out on the ground and you look for the fat workers and you take those out because that's your laying worker. Well, I hate to break it to you, but there's no way to fix this situation. We call this a hopelessly queenless colony because it's hopeless. The only way you can rectify this situation is to combine this queenless colony, this laying worker colony, with a queen right colony. You cannot add a queen to this. You can throw money at this all you want. You can put queen after queen in there and they're just going to kill her. They're not going to accept her because your workers are already laying. The only way you can fix this is by combining. So this is a lost colony. And if we are not constantly managing and monitoring our colony through regular inspections, and you get yourself in this situation in the UP or Northern Michigan, especially if it's like late July, August, you could pretty much kiss this colony goodbye for the rest of the season. The only way you can get this to even come out to anything is by combining. But like I said, this is a situation that you need to be able to identify immediately. Because if you just let this go between your inspections, you'll come back and this colony will just be full of drones. Why? And I had mentioned it earlier, because workers are laying. And it's multiple workers. It's not just one. It's multiple workers. And so the reason that you're finding a colony full of drones is because they can't lay fertilized eggs. They're not mated. They can only lay drone eggs. The other thing that you'll see with laying worker colonies is the drones that are in the colony are small. And the reason for that is because these workers are not queens. Queens determine whether it's going to be a fertilized egg or an unfertilized egg based on the size and depth of the cell. Drone cells are bigger cells because they're bigger bees. But workers don't know that. And workers lay eggs everywhere. I mean, you can see them. I mean, they'll lay them on pollen. They'll lay them everywhere in these combs. But they're laying drone eggs in worker cells. And so the drones that come out of there are small. And so you end up with a colony that just declines very quickly. A laying worker situation will take out a colony in several weeks. So this is something you have to pay attention to. And at the colony level, at our superorganism level, this will cause a superorganism to die if it's not managed. All right, let's talk about divisional labor. So we've talked about kind of these conditions that you need to be aware of at the colony level. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the division of labor at the colony level. Now, I know we talked a little bit about this in the biology of the individual lecture, but I just wanted to come back to it to talk just a few details about kind of how this works. So we talked about pheromones being such an important part of the colony itself. Now, pheromones, when it comes to insects in general, pheromones, chiromones, cinnamones, all of these different types of chemicals that are interpreted by insects in general, it's essentially the language of insects. So you can think of these volatile chemicals that are floating around in the air that are being produced by bees, being produced by plants, being produced by those types of organisms in the landscape as basically language happening in the landscape. And bees are interpreting that language through those chemoreceptors that we talked about that are on the antennae. So when we're talking about pheromones, these are how bees are communicating with one another, but these pheromones will also dictate how things happen in the colony. We talked about ovary development in the absence of queen pheromone, but it also impacts the roles of workers. So let's talk about this a little bit in the context of like nurse bees and foragers. So based on the needs of the colony, pheromones can dictate this, or factors affecting the colony can dictate this. We talked about the things that pheromones can impact. So we talked about, like, for example, the laying worker situation. But the example when it comes to actually dividing labor based on the needs of the colony, that can happen within the worker class, within the worker caste, based on the needs of the colony. For example, so we have nurse bees and we have foragers. We have essentially house bees that are maintaining everything in the house, in the colony itself. They're the ones that are rearing brood. They're the ones that are storing pollen and nectar. As foragers come in, they're passing these resources off to house bees that are going up and storing nectar up in the honey supers or wherever it needs to be at that time. If we get into a situation where there is essentially like a die-off of foragers. So say, for example, we had a really beautiful day that turned all of a sudden, foragers couldn't get back. We had a massive die-off of foragers one day because of a freak storm that came through. What will happen in the colony is the colony essentially, the individuals note that there is an absence of foragers because there's a lack of resources coming into the colony. And so nurse bees will actually change to foragers early if that is the case. Conversely, if we had something where a bunch of nurse bees had died off, and there was a brood chamber that needed to be maintained, foragers can revert back to nurse bees. And this is not only is this just the physical act of changing your responsibility, but there's some biology changes that go along with it. So, like for example, the hyperpharyngeal gland, which is responsible for producing royal jelly in nurse bees, when they become foragers, it produces enzymes that actually break down nectar. So there's actually changes, the glandular changes, the biological changes can go based on the needs of the colony as well. So it's an important thing to understand that the division of labor is not only dictated by pheromones, but it's also dictated by factors happening in the colony that lead bees to need to kind of change what they're doing. They are able to adapt to those situations very readily. It's one of the reasons why the species has proliferated for over the entire globe, essentially, is because they have this ability to kind of meet the needs of and demands of what's happening in the environment and what's happening in the colony. When we think about the superorganism over time, we also need to take into consideration what's happening in the colony population-wise, okay? So this is a graph that Randy Oliver put together from some research from Harris that he did in the 80s. And essentially what this is seasonal buildup of colonies in Manitoba, Canada. So this was about the closest research I could find to where we're at that actually lays this out in a nice way, and essentially comparing overwintered colonies to packaged colonies. So what I want you to pay attention to is I want you to pay attention to a couple of things. One, I just really want you to pay attention to this blue line right here. Let me get over to my other screen here. This blue line right here represents a packaged colony. This is where most beginners are going to be, okay? So this is what your colony is doing population-wise over the course of the season. We start in May with an installed package, and your installed package is going to have about 3 pounds of bees. It's going to be about 6,000 bees, let's say. So you start here with about 6,000 bees. Essentially, there is a kind of an adjustment process as packages start to take hold, because packages, when you install them on new equipment, they have to draw out the comb before that queen can actually start laying. And that's a very resource intensive process. So you tend to see a little bit of a dip right there at the beginning. But immediately after comb is drawn, you see this huge ramp up over the course of June, July, and it kind of peaks out at the end of July for us, is where kind of our peak population is. And once we hit that point, colonies decline in population very quickly. Now, the reason this is important to understand at the colony level is because our activity period for us here in the UP is very limited. You see that like this peak is literally only over a few months. And that illustrates that we really have to be on our game. You have to be a better beekeeper in the Upper Peninsula and Northern Michigan than you have to be in lower latitudes. It's and the reason is because our season is so short. Everything happens so damn fast up here that if you aren't on the ball, if you aren't making the right calls all the time during the season, there's very little room to be able to adjust, especially once we hit July. Once we get to the end of July, you have a few weeks in August to correct things. If you have a problem, like say a laying worker situation you find at the end of July, there's really no way to correct that other than combining a colony and they'll be fine. But if you were to try to correct that situation somehow, and like I said, you're not going to be able to do it by adding a queen, but if you just tried, you're wasting time. And if you say you found a queenless colony in late July, tried to introduce a queen into it, say she failed. Maybe it wasn't even a laying worker situation. Maybe you just lost a queen for some reason. You try to reintroduce a new queen. That takes, a little bit of time, and you're now into, say, the second week of August. We're getting close to things shutting down very quickly. And I mean, we all know that, by the time of the end of September, beginning of October, things can change very quickly. So you just have to be much better up here. And I'm glad you all are taking this educational course, because it's just a lot harder. We see overwintering losses at much higher rates up here. And that's anecdotal evidence that I just have seen over the years. But we see overwintering losses much higher up here than we do in lower latitudes. And the reason is just because we have such a long period of winter, which means that we have just a very short season. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the superorganism and what your responsibilities are and what you can kind of see over the course of the season, I want to really leave you today with a couple big kind of things. And one of them is this chart that I have taken quite a lot of time to put together, which really lays out what's going on over the entire course of the season for the Upper Peninsula and Northern Michigan. And I've broken this down into 4 areas. What's happening at the superorganism level, what's happening with forage in the landscape, what you're doing as a beekeeper, and then what Varroa is up to and what you should be thinking about as far as management of Varroa over that course of time. So these 4 things are things we're going to talk through here. And I hope you take this and really kind of understand what this means for you. And the short version is that the season's short and you need to be on your game. That's the short version of all of this, but let's go through it in a little more detail. Let's start at the superorganisms, since that's what we've been talking about during this whole lecture. And I'm going to start in January just because that's the beginning of the year. So in January through kind of mid-February, bees are still clustered up. They're in a winter cluster. The priority is to thermoregulate, to stay warm. They're feeding on honey, burning calories to basically create heat. That's your winter cluster. Depending on the year, and that's why you see these kind of boxes with these slashes in here, because these are kind of overlap areas. Depending on the year and the seasonality, spring buildup, which is when brood starts to be put on, tends to start up here kind of around mid-February to maybe as late as mid-March if the weather is really, really bad. But generally, we start to see brood put on in about mid-February up here. Once that happens, the priorities of the colony change entirely. So it goes from just feeding on honey and maintaining the thermoregulation of that cluster to now we are putting on brood, and we are going to stay on that brood because the brood has to be heated to a little over 90 degrees and has to stay there. If brood goes below that, it gets chilled and dies. And so the colony will just stay on that brood. This is one of the most vulnerable periods of a colony's life in the Upper Peninsula and northern Michigan, because this is the time where we're still in winter. They're hunkered down on brood. They need to have food right near that brood in order to be able to continue to thermoregulate that brood and not have to leave it to go get food somewhere else in the hive. So that is a period of time where we tend to see starvation happening because the priorities of the colony have changed to maintaining brood temperature rather than just thermoregulating the cluster. When we get into this area, so say like mid-March, March to mid-March, we start to see spring buildup. This is when the colony is building up in colony strength, broods being laid. You know, there are some warm days in here. Some years, April might be a really nice month, and bees may be foraging that month during spring buildup. Other years, it may still have snow on the ground, and they may be building up in the absence of the ability to forage. And so that means that we have to get in the colonies and supplementally feed them at that point. What we see here is when we get into kind of the June, I'd say kind of like, depending on the season, again, depending on how short the season is as far as the winter is concerned, we can see reproductive swarms starting in kind of, I'd say late May through June. But what's happening once we hit that kind of June area is honey flows starting, and that's when they're storing honey in the colony. Once we get through kind of late July, mid to late July, we start to see a dearth in our areas. And what that means is essentially that forage resources just kind of dry up. The native flowers, they have a different bloom cycle, and that tends to be kind of where there's an absence of blooms in the landscape. You have a lot of introduced species, say if you're on like an orchard or something like that, where it's not, not native species that have this dearth period. You're going to have forage resources available. We tend to plant buckwheat for this time of the year because buckwheat's flowering during this time of the year when anything else really isn't. So it does give a forage resource to our bees. But you tend to see a dearth during that time. When we hit mid-August, the reason that I say you got to correct everything by mid-August is because by mid-August, your bees are starting to put on winter bees already. Your bees are already preparing for winter. And we've only had like 4 months of decent weather at that point. And now your bees are already hunkering, getting ready for winter. So at this point, they're starting to raise winter bees. Your colony has to be in optimal health at this time of the year. Otherwise, if you have varroa mite problems, if you have pathogens that are in the colony, it's going to affect your winter bees. And those are the bees that need to be able to survive the entire winter. Just to put this in context, a worker bee, 21 days from egg to hatch. Essentially, after those 21 days, they're going to live a total of about 40 to 60 days. It's not a very long time for a worker bee, a summer bee that's a worker. Winter bees live 4 to 6 months. The biology is very different of them, but the key thing is if their biology is compromised, especially by varroa, there is no chance your colony will make it through the winter. Absolutely no chance, which is why varroa management seasonally is so important. Varroa management is not a fall activity. If you think that you're going to treat your bees in October and they're going to survive the winter because you treated for varroa, that is not going to happen. Varroa management starts early and it goes through the entire season, because if we do not have a managed population of varroa and low disease presence, by the time winter bees are put on, you're not going to survive. After that, we're back in the cluster, back in the mid-October. So you can see really when we're talking about like the season we're working our bees, it's very short. When we look at the forage line here, you can see that from like mid-September all the way through April, well, really kind of, depending on the season, it could be all the way to May. But essentially during that time of the year, there's nothing for bees to eat in the landscape. They're not flying during the winter, but there's nothing flowering. And so for us up here, we literally have half of the year where bees cannot forage. It doesn't mean they're not eating. And so we oftentimes have to supplement food up here as well, which is our responsibility as a beekeeper. So there's no forage available then. And then all of a sudden, everything starts blooming. Spring's like 2 weeks in northern Michigan and the UP. It all happens really fast, so you got to be on your game. But pollen starts coming in buckets. I mean, just tons of pollen coming in. My wife and I jokingly refer to this period of time as the pollening, because it's just pollen is everywhere. I mean, if you were to cut down a pine tree during this time of the year and it hit the ground, well, you would have a plume of pollen that would come up from that. So tons of pollen coming in during this time of the year. Then it switches right to the honey flow, and we are in the thick of it, depending on the season. Sometimes, June is when we're starting to see things, but generally by Mother's Day, things are warming up. We're starting to see some blooms happening. And so by that time, there's going to be a little bit of honey coming in, but the main flow is going to be kind of like the end of, I'd say like mid-June through like mid-July is going to be our main honey flow. Now, we can also have a fall honey flow as well with things like goldenrod, buckwheat, those types of things, some late season asters. But don't ever count on that up here, because we all know that essentially when we get into the fall, the kind of the forward time of fall, when these things are generally flowering, it's pretty dicey what kind of weather we can have. And nectar production is reliant on two things. It's reliant on three things. Sunlight, but we're getting plenty of sun during that time, but it's really reliant on moisture and heat. So if we have decent weather, but there's no rain, the flowers aren't going to be producing any nectar. And so a late season forage crop is not even happening. I tend to see up here in the UP, we tend to get goldenrod flows maybe once every few years. It's not something that's reliable. Lower peninsula, like the lower peninsula, absolutely. They a lot of times will get a good goldenrod flow down near the border, down near the southern border. But us up here in northern climates, that fall planning for kind of like a fall flow, it can be very deceiving. And if you're thinking that you're going to make weight off of a fall flow to get through winter, that's not a winning combination. That's and 9 times that. Well, I'd say like maybe 25% of the time you can depend on a fall flow up here, but it generally does not happen. So after that main honey flow, we see a hard dearth generally. This area right here, this kind of late August, September to mid-September would be where we would have a goldenrod flow if we had one. That's why I've got it kind of in this hashed color here. And then we're back to no forage by mid-September. And again, all the way through April. So, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, that's 7 months with no food resources. That's why it's so important for us to be taking an active role in this. All right, let's go down to the beekeeper line. All right, so after January, so when after January hits, and this is not a hard and fast rule. This is just something I've observed over 15 years of beekeeping and a decade of teaching and doing research and all of that kind of stuff with honeybees, is that we tend to see so if your bee survived through January, up to January, that tends to mean that varroa mites have pretty much been under control. If you have a colony that's compromised by varroa mites, they tend to decline very quickly. Either they abscond in the fall, meaning that they just leave because of high varroa load, or they just die very early on. So if you have a colony that dies before the first of the year, it's like 99% guaranteed that they died of mites. And the reason is because the mites feed on an organ that's critical to winter survival called the fat body. So the fat body is one of the most critical components of winter survival. We'll talk about it in detail in a later lecture, but that's the reason why your colonies don't survive those first couple months of the winter, is because their fat storage organ has been compromised and they can't put on the fat that they need to survive the winter. So they just die very quickly. But if you get past that January date, that is when we get into the time where starvation can become a problem, because bees are motoring through honey. If you have a very cold year where we have a January and February where we're constantly in single digit temperatures, below zero temperatures, they are motoring through honey. And so generally during this time of the year, January, February, March, April, depending on how long that cycle lasts, I'm usually in my colonies about every 3 weeks just to make sure that they have enough food. Now, I'm not digging in them. I'm just peeking in to see where the cluster is. And we'll talk about this in the overwintering lecture and what essentially is one of your last lectures, which will be getting ready for spring. But essentially, you need to be monitoring during that time of the year. This is the time where I see most people lose their bees in the UP if they've been managing varroa mite, because they just think that if they've gotten varroa mite under control, everything should be good. But again, we have a very short season, and those bees need a lot of honey to deal with our cold temperatures. So you got to be conscious of that. The other thing you should be doing there during this time of the year is ordering bees and equipment. You always want to be ordering bees early on. Tends to be that by March, most of the time it's pretty difficult to find nukes. You can still find packages by then. Packages start arriving generally in early May, late April. So you want to get that stuff all squared away before you get into the kind of early part of the season. When we get into April, depending on the weather, April to mid-May, we can be doing spring reversals. That's where, as the colony moves up in the box, feeding on honey, the whole cluster will end up somewhere near the top of the box by this time of the year. We take those top boxes and put them on the bottom, and take the empty bottom boxes and put those on top, and that's a spring reversal. And that's how we reorient the hive so that brood chamber is back down at the bottom. So that is what a spring reversal is during that time of the year. We also will see packages start arriving here in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula during this time as well. Splits in this area tend to happen usually late May through June is when splits are being made. That is also when your nukes will be arriving, because and that is all, temperature dependent and weather dependent as well. But generally, you'll start to see nukes being released that are produced in the UP in northern Michigan. Generally around the 1st of June is when those start to get released. If they're coming from out of state, you can see them a lot earlier. But if you're looking for colonies that have been overwintered in Michigan, you're generally going to have to wait until about June to get those. Essentially, after we hit that splits period, now we are in the thick of it. We are managing space and health over the rest of that season right there through kind of August. Now you're going to be managing health all the way through pretty much mid-September is kind of the last time that you can get a regular treatment in. You will, and we'll talk about this in the next line, but you will be able to get a late season treatment in. Usually in kind of early September, you can get a good late season mite treatment in that's not oxalic acid. Oxalic acid, if you recall, is only used during broodless period. So it's not used during the season. It's only used during broodless period. And now I know there's a lot of folks that are using it during the season. That is an illegal pesticide application is what's happening there, because the EPA has not approved oxalic acid for use on colonies that have honey being put on. And so that's something important to note. But essentially, when we're managing space during this time and health all the way kind of through this area of September, when we hit kind of mid-August, we start preparing our bees for winter. So this is when we start doing fall feeding. If we need to put on some weight, this is when we're correcting any issues that need to be corrected to make sure our bees are healthy going into the winter. And then finally, when we're getting into late October through December, we're winterizing our hives. As far as management of Varroa is concerned, when you're in January through March, you're really not doing anything as far as Varroa management. They're clustered up. There's not much you can do. Keep in mind, I know people have been seeing this kind of this year is the first year I've really been seeing a lot of people doing oxalic acid applications during very cold times. Now, keep in mind that although we use these products to manage Varroa mite, we do not use them prophylactically, meaning that we just don't use them willy-nilly. We use them for a reason, because these miticides that we're putting in these colonies don't come without a cost. Most of them do cause some bee die-off. And in fact, formic acid says right on the label that you can expect 1,500 bees a day to die the first 3 days of the application. It's okay. It's part of that process. I mean, it's not great that we're killing bees, but you're losing 3,000, 4,000 bees to save 60,000. So it's definitely, it works out math-wise, and it is something that we just have to do. No one likes managing Varroa. Varroa has not always been in the United States. It came into Michigan, I think, in 1987, and it has changed beekeeping forever as far as what we do as beekeepers. We used to manage bees. We manage Varroa mites now and do a little bit of bee management, but Varroa is the number one thing. Okay, so we get at this no management period. When we hit kind of like February through maybe mid-March, depending on the year and the season, that's when we're going to hit them with oxalic acid. And that's generally when the brood has not been put on, but is just getting started if we're getting to that close period. So generally, if it's a really kind of cold year, you can get away with into March with that, because generally brood may be delayed a little bit then. If it's a really kind of oddly warm year, maybe you're going to be doing that oxalic acid application in late February, early March. We get back after that OA application, and now brood is on. Keep that in mind. So we're not going to be using oxalic acid anymore. We do go through a little bit of period, kind of through April and May, where there may be no management of mites happening at that period. We can't really do Varroa mite checks at that point because the warmth is just not here to dig into a hive. So you're doing an early season OA application, and then you've got a little time off as far as the management. But as soon as weather changes, and I have this kind of marked here in that slash area, usually around kind of Mother's Day is planting day for a lot of us in northern Michigan and the UP. When we get to kind of that area, that is when we're going to be starting to manage and monitor intensely the rest of the season. And we'll talk about how we do that in a later lecture. But essentially, you're going to be monitoring and managing Varroa mite over the entire rest of the season. So pretty much from mid-May all the way through to October, you're going to be monitoring and managing mites. It's not an end of season activity. It is an all season activity. If you want good survival, it's an all season activity. If you don't care, then, then I hope you start caring soon, because these bees are important and we need to have them surviving. And so by taking that management seriously, and I think I said this earlier, I've been doing this a long time and I've been teaching this a long time. When students start taking Varroa management seriously, bees start surviving. It's that simple. So you're going to be doing that during that season. Varroa is going to peak as far as population somewhere around late July, August. So just as we are starting to see winter bees being put on, coincides with peak Varroa. So if you have not managed before that and you get to August and you've done nothing, your winter bees have been compromised. It's just, you're not going to get survival. The winter bees are being fed upon by mites, transmitting viruses, feeding on fat bodies. They are never going to be able to be healthy enough to get you through the winter, which is why this is a season-long effort. When we get to the end of the season, usually in October is when we can do an oxalic acid application. Weather dependent, it can be into like early November if we've got a really kind of, warm fall, I'll say. But most of the time you're going to be doing that in October, and then we're back to no management November, starting in November. So that's kind of a synopsis of the total kind of colony life cycle here in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. At the superorganism level, what's happening in the forage, in the landscape with forage, what you're going to be doing as a beekeeper, and what you're going to be doing with Varroa. So put this together to kind of give you a full kind of idea of what that season is going to look like. But the take home here is that, again, you got to be a better beekeeper than most folks because of the short season. And that's just a fact of location, right? It's not easy beekeeping up here in the Upper Peninsula in Northern Michigan, but it is doable, and you can do it very successfully. And I always come back to the fact that Canada has a very robust beekeeping industry. It gets much colder in Canada than it does up here. So we can do this. You just got to understand the organism, and you got to take that management seriously. All right, so balance is the key, is really what it comes down to. It's you being able to balance all these responsibilities, helping the bees maintain balance throughout the season. And really what your responsibilities come down to is that we got to always ensure we're queen right. This is why inspections are so important on a regular basis, is not only to be managing and monitoring for pests and pathogens, but also ensuring that we're queen right. Because if we don't have a laying queen that's doing a good job, it is detrimental to our hive. And again, because we have such a short season, it's hard to recover from some of these sometimes. One of the other things I'll say regarding queens is that, one of the things that a lot of people will take into consideration is like, well, if I lose a queen, they're just going to raise a new queen. And that is the case a lot of times. If there are eggs present in a colony that were laid by a queen, they can raise another queen from those eggs. The problem really becomes is that if you think that you're going to let your colony raise a queen, I would say anytime after July, raising a queen is a 4-week process. It only takes 16 days for her to come out, but then she's got to go mate. And that generally takes about a week to kind of get the right weather and the right conditions to go mate on a mating flight. Sometimes if we have bad weather, it can take up to 2 weeks. And then it takes a little while for her to come back and get going. So, this notion that we can, wait a month for a colony to put on a queen in the Upper Peninsula in Northern Michigan, if we lose a queen, it's usually a pretty dicey situation. And so, it's important that we make sure that our queens are healthy during the season. If you do lose a queen during the season, I would highly recommend buying a mated queen if you're here in the Upper Peninsula in Northern Michigan. Just raising your own queen is just going to be, it's going to be a tough thing. And then also keep in mind, only about 80% of virgin queens make it back to the colony. When a virgin goes on a mating flight, it is the riskiest point in her life. And she's a target to predators like birds, just like any other flying insect that's out there. So it's also something to keep in mind. We are responsible for providing them the resources when they need them. Like I said, during the honey flow, you don't need to be adding any sugar or adding sugar syrup or anything like that. But when we're in the winter, supplemental feed is oftentimes a really important thing. Additionally, if you're in an area where there's not a lot of water present, you're going to have to add water. It's a resource they're going to need. If you're in an area that's maybe just a forested area that's just thick with forest, you're probably going to need to add some forage resources around that are not just flowering trees, even though flowering trees can be fantastic nectar and pollen sources. So just understanding that we are providing resources, we are managing them. They are livestock. These are domesticated animals. These are not wild animals. We are managing their health throughout the season. It's important that we maintain healthy colonies throughout the season so that we can overwinter and be successful. And then we also are going to be maintaining colony space throughout the season to prevent swarms and make sure that we're maximizing the use of space for those bees. And then the big one here, monitoring pests and pathogens. Monitoring and managing, that should say, pests and pathogens is a really important thing and something that is critical to your success. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you at the next one.